going to go through his country. He hesitated. So the CIA's purpose, and it served, and we should not be installed by the CIA. Okay, so I think your President Erdogan was correct when he visited this country, and I think he spoke recently on CNN saying that, you know, anti-Semitism is a crime, so should Islamophobia be a crime against humanity. And he mentioned when he was at a mosque in Maryland that there is a wave of Islamophobia in this country. And I think that one of the reasons that there is because the American people really believed George W. Bush when he said that, well, they hate us for our freedom. And I'm going to get around to your question about ISIS in this manner, because I think that most Americans are not aware of the history and the legacy of American interference in the Middle East, in countries like Syria, like Iraq, back in the 1950s, 1960s, even the 1940s, that laid the foundation for this anti-American sentiment. No, they don't hate us for our freedom. The Muslim world is angry at the United States. The Arab world is angry at the United States for all the years that the CIA has engineered countries. Probably very few people realize that back in 1949, there was a CIA great anger at the democratically elected leader in Syria, whose name I believe was, his last name was al-Kuwaiti, and he did not agree to this American pipeline project that was going to go through his country. He hesitated, so there was a coup to overthrow him with someone who was more amenable to that. And this, of course, happened in different countries as well. Many people don't realize that Saddam Hussein was actually installed by the CIA. And they may not remember that back in 1953, when the Iranian, democratically elected Iranian leader Mossadegh did not want BP to be taking all the oil profits and wanted to renegotiate the terms, you know, the CIA sent in Kermit Roosevelt and others to overthrow the democratically elected leader of Iran and bring in the Shah. And this was all for Western profits to do with our addiction to oil. You know, I think that when I go back to your question about ISIS, well, people think it just started, you know, with the American 2003 invasion of Iraq. And yes, it's true, that's probably a direct outcome. You have these disenfranchised Sunnis who experience, I mean, they're probably actually the children of the people who were in prisons and in torture chambers during the American invasion and grew up with this brutality. And, you know, to me, this is just part of the legacy of American interventionism that has brought nothing but anger and violence to the Middle East, and this cycle is continuing. It's a terrible history, and of course, the current conflict in Syria with Daesh is also part of a pipeline. I feel that part of the conflict that we're dealing with now in Syria has to do with our addiction to petroleum, with oil and gas. Is now also sadly reaping the dire consequences of this. I mean, Turkish civilians in Ankara and other cities are now dying because of the ISIS threat. So when people go back and say, well, this is all the Americans' fault, well, yes, it is, but we do have allies in the region who are helping to fund this violence. And in my opinion, the best way to begin to unravel this and to bring peace back to the region is we need to dry up the funds that are contributing to this. Now, let me say also, before anyone rushes to judgment, in this conflagration, to think about the consequences in the region. I mean, why are we having so many refugees? Why is Turkey having to deal with this flow of refugees now with the agreement with the EU? We've got to stop this, or otherwise it's going to continue. And I think it can only benefit all of us to look at the roots of this problem, which is our addiction to oil. Even back in the 70s with the U.S. training of the Taliban and involvement with the beginnings of Al Qaeda as a backlash to what happened in Afghanistan, that has laid the groundwork for this kind of resentment. And of course, ISIS is an outgrowth of the latest intervention, which is what happened in Iraq. From 2003, but for me the roots are much deeper in order to understand the depth of this. And now we see the attacks in Brussels and Paris and in your country and elsewhere, and this is really getting out of control. And I think if you look at history, you see that violence on violence doesn't really solve anything. Who is profiting from all of this? The arms companies, the corporations. And, who are all these people fighting for? They're fighting for the corporations that will get rich from the oil or the gas pipelines that they want to go through there. So really, if we want to stop the flows of refugees, if we want to stop the bloodshed in European capitals, in your country, in our country, we have got to stop the flow of arms to Syria. To think so, and it certainly it certainly would not be beyond the pale to imagine it. But I believe in this case, if you go back to a defense intelligence report that was written in 2012 and that was revealed actually earlier last year, there were predictions that the ISIS or the Daesh could spin out of control, that there could be a conglomeration of Sunni extremists that could form this Daesh and then spin out of control, that it could happen. And I don't think it was a creation of the CIA, to be perfectly honest, but I think that it served the CIA's purpose, and it served, and we should not leave out Israel and other countries in the region that also wanted the overthrow of Bashar, and just kind of allowed things to play out to their advantage. I think that Islamic extremists have been used in the past in other countries, such as Afghanistan with the Mujahideen, etc., to achieve certain goals. But I would disagree that Daesh is actually a creation. I think it is a natural progression of the violence that came out of Iraq. Attacks. And of course, being a former CIA political analyst, I hesitate to say anything without enough information. So I wouldn't speculate that, but I will tell you this. I am aware that Daesh is very interested in creating provocations in the West in order to tempt or to force the United States to intervene militarily in Syria. And the reason they would like to do this, of course, is because they would like to eliminate any voices of moderation, and by generating these explosions and provocations, they have come close to it. But as you know, there is a very delicate ceasefire holding in Syria. I know there's still some fighting going on, but it's difficult to say without the real facts. I mean, I think this is part of a real effort to bring the United States in militarily. about the crisis in Syria and the refugees, you have to ask yourself, why are there so many refugees? Why is Turkey having to deal with this problem? Why don't we just address the root of the problem and stop giving arms to the people that are fighting it? And I would agree. I mean, if there are intelligence agencies involved in helping the PKK or others, or Daesh or others in the region, they should withdraw their support because it just exacerbates the situation in the region. International relations for finding a peaceful solution to these conflicts, and it doesn't help. So again, we go back to the story of external meddling in Middle Eastern affairs. Intelligence agencies would look back at the history and the decades of their involvement and see that it hasn't benefited anyone. Maybe perhaps some oil or international companies have been richer, but when you look at the national interests of the people involved, I'm talking about the interests of the Turkish people, the Syrian people, the Iraqi people, etc., it hasn't helped at all. So, we need to draw lessons from these decades of careless interventions, and let the countries work things out for themselves. I would say let Turkey work things out with the Kurds, and let's not let external intelligence agencies be involved. I would go back to just kind of an analogy where I bring up sometimes when people see a terrorist problem, they think that they can shoot everyone and kill all of them. And that to me is like finding a swamp of mosquitoes and trying to kill individual mosquitoes. What you have to do is to drain the swamp. And how do you drain the swamp? You dry up the supply of arms. So I would call for an embargo of all military weapons to all parties in Syria. And I'm talking about al-Nusra Front, I'm talking about Al-Qaeda, Daesh, the armed Kurdish militant groups. Let's just stop. I always wonder how it is that in these countries where there are wars, somehow people are starving, but the flow of bullets and arms continue. Why don't we let food in? Why don't we let drones and other airplanes drop food, and let's just put an embargo completely on the bullets? I think it is a key country, and I think that, as you know, there have recently been expanded U.S. military bases there, so it's certainly a very strategic place for U.S. and Western interests, and it has a strategic place in between the Mediterranean and the European countries. So I think that it's an important country, and it has a lot to offer the region in terms of its history, its culture, and its political power. It certainly has an influential role in the region. Yeah. Well, I have to say, from what I've seen, yeah, it looks like your president has had a bad press recently. I read about the problem in front of the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. I guess that the Germans have been putting satirical television programs on about Erdogan. So, he is having a bad press day in Europe and the United States these days. But let's not make any mistake. I mean, I am sure he's well aware, and you're well aware, of how much they need Turkey, but the Europeans need him because he's helping them with the refugee problem. And of course, he plays an instrumental role for the Americans in terms of strategic military operations out of Incirlik